Silas the Saint Vane is a man who rules with surgical precision, believing that emotions are a tax the weak pay to the strong. During a ruthless collection sweep, he encounters Mia, a small girl who offers him her last dollar, not out of fear, but as a formal contract. When Silas takes the coin to maintain his image, her whispered reason for the payment, a plea for him to assassinate the cancer-killing her brother, shatters his psychological armor. The story follows the 24 hours that follow, as Silas realizes his saintly order has actually created the hell this girl lives in. He chooses to burn his own empire down to fulfill the contract of a single dollar, transforming from a predator of the streets to their ultimate, albeit scarred, guardian. The air in the marketplace was thick and heavy, smelling of damp pavement and old exhaust. Silas the Saint Vane moved through the crowd like a shark through dark water. Every step he took in his polished leather shoes felt a ripple of fear through the people. Vendors pulled back their carts. Mothers pulled their children into the shadows. In this part of the city, Silas wasn't just a man, he was the storm. He stopped in front of an old fruit stall. His bodyguards stood behind him, their faces as hard as stone. Silas didn't have to say a word. The old vendor, with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, reached into a wooden box to hand over the weekly protection money. But before the envelope could touch Silas's hand, something small moved in the corner of his eye. A little girl, no older than 8, stepped out from behind a stack of crates. She was wearing a pink dress that was torn at the shoulder and clutching a teddy bear that had seen better days. The street went deathly quiet. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. No one ever approached the saint. It was the first rule of survival. Silas looked down, his gray eyes cold and sharp. "You're in the way, kid," he said, his voice like sliding gravel. The girl didn't move. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a single, crumpled $1 bill. Her small hand trembled, but her gaze was steady. She held it out toward her massive, ring-covered hand. "I heard you're the man who makes things happen," she whispered. Her voice was tiny, but in the silence of the street, it sounded like a shout. "I heard people pay you to take away their problems." Silas felt a strange prickle at the back of his neck. He didn't take the money, but he didn't move away either. "That's $1, little one. That doesn't buy much in this world." "It's all I have," she said, a single tear finally rolling down her dirt-smudged cheek. "I don't want you to protect me. I want to hire you to kill the monster." One of the bodyguards laughed, but Silas silenced him with a sharp look. He knelt, his expensive suit trousers pressing into the dirty cobblestones. He was now eye to eye with her. "What monster?" The girl leaned in, her breath smelling like nothing but hunger. "The cancer," she choked out. "The doctor said it's eating my brother's lungs. He said only a miracle can stop it. And everyone says you own the miracles in this town." Silas froze. The dollar bill sat in his palm, feeling heavier than a mountain of gold. For the first time in 20 years, the great Silas Vane had nothing to say. Behind him, the street stayed silent, waiting to see if the monster would crush the child or if the child had just broken the monster. Silas stood up slowly, the crumpled dollar bill still tucked into the palm of his hand. He didn't put it in his pocket. He just gripped it, feeling the rough paper against his skin. Around him, the market was still frozen. The silence was so heavy it felt like it might break the windows of the nearby shops. His bodyguards shifted behind him, their leather jackets creaking. They were waiting for a command, a sign that the saint was back to business. "Move," Silas said quietly. It wasn't a shout, but the crowd left instantly, like a curtain being pulled back. As he walked, the true weight of his king's toll became clear. This was his kingdom, but it was a kingdom of shadows. He passed a bakery where the shelves were half empty because the owner had to pay Silas before he could buy flour. He saw a mechanic working under a car with rusted tools because the safety tax Silas collected took away his profit. Every person he passed looked at the ground. They didn't see a leader, they saw a ghost that took their bread and their hope. For years, Silas had told himself this was just how the world worked. He thought he was bringing order to the chaos. He called it logic. He believed that if he was strong, the city would be stable. But today, the city didn't feel stable. It felt broken. The gray walls of the apartment buildings looked like tombstones, and the puddles on the ground reflected a man he didn't recognize anymore. "Boss, we're behind schedule," his second-in-command, a man named Russo, muttered. Russo was looking at his gold watch, his eyes narrowed. "We still have 3 blocks to hit before the sun goes down. The shopkeepers are waiting with the envelopes. If we don't show up on time, they'll think we're getting lazy." Silas didn't answer. He watched a woman quickly hide a small bag of groceries behind her back as he passed. She was afraid he would find a way to tax even her dinner. He looked at the dollar in his hand again. To him, $1 was nothing. He spent thousands on dinner and wine. But to that girl, that dollar was the difference between a meal and a prayer. He realized that his toll wasn't just about money. He was collecting their lives, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but fear. The pinstripe suit he wore felt tight, like it was shocking him. He had spent his whole life building this empire of iron, but a single whispered word from a child had made the metal feel like it was starting to melt. "The collections are over for today," Silas said, his voice echoing off the brick walls. Russo blinked, confused. "Over? Boss, we're talking about $50,000 left on the street." "I said we're done," Silas snapped, his gray eyes flashing like lightning. "Go back to the car." As Silas turned away, he felt the eyes of the neighborhood on his back. For the first time, they weren't just watching a predator. They were watching a king who had finally noticed the ruins of his own palace. Silas didn't get into the car. Instead, he stood by the heavy black door, watching the spot where the girl had disappeared into a narrow, dark alleyway. Russo and the other men stood by, their faces twisted in confusion. They lived by a clock and a code, and Silas had just broken both. The street was starting to move again, but only in whispers. People watched from behind cracked windows, wondering why the wolf was still standing in their garden. Suddenly, a small shadow flickered near the edge of a brick building. It was her. Mia hadn't run away. She was standing about 20 feet away, her small fingers twisting the ear of her headless teddy bear. She looked tiny against the massive, gray walls of the city, like a single flower trying to grow through a sidewalk. "You took it," she said. Her voice was steady now, lacking the high pitch of a typical child. "The dollar. That means we have a deal." Russo stepped forward, his face red with anger. "Hey, kid. Get lost before I..." Silas held up a single hand, and Russo stopped mid-sentence as if he'd hit a wall. Silas didn't look at his man. His focus was entirely on the girl. He walked toward her, his long strides eating up the distance. He stopped just a few feet away, noticing the way her oversized sneakers were held together by mismatched string. "A deal usually has a handshake," Silas said, his voice softer than any of his men had ever heard it. "And a contract needs a witness." "The street saw," Mia replied, pointing a small, dirt-smudged finger toward the onlookers. "They all saw the saint take a girl's last hope. My mama says a deal with a saint is forever." Silas felt a cold winter. He knew she didn't mean saint as a holy title, she meant it as his feared nickname. But in her mouth, it sounded like a heavy responsibility. She wasn't acting like a victim. She was acting like a business partner. She had stepped out of the shadows and broken the biggest rule of the neighborhood, never look the boss in the eye. "Where is he?" Silas asked. "The brother you want the miracle for?" Mia hugged her teddy bear tighter to her chest. She turned and began to walk deeper into the alley, where the light of the street lamps couldn't reach. She didn't look back to see if he was following. She simply expected him to. Silas followed her into the dark. Behind him, he could hear Russo calling out, warning him that it could be a trap, that the alleys were dangerous, and that he was losing his mind. Silas ignored them all. For the first time in his life, he wasn't following the money or the power. He was following a pair of frayed blue shoelaces and a little girl who was too brave for her own good. The alley grew narrow and cold, smelling of rain and old bricks. Silas followed the girl, his expensive leather shoes clicking against the wet stones. Every few steps, Mia would glance back, her large eyes catching the faint light from the windows above. She led him to a small, heavy metal door at the back of a crumbling apartment building. Silas looked up at the building. It was a place he owned, but he had never stepped inside. He saw the broken glass and the flickering lights. He realized that the money he collected every week was taken from people who couldn't even afford a warm place to sleep. Mia stopped and turned to face him. She stood under a single, buzzing light bulb. She looked up at Silas, who stood like a giant in the darkness. "The doctor told Mama that the medicine costs too much," she whispered. "He said that even if we sold everything we had, we couldn't buy enough time. He told her to pray for a miracle." She stepped closer to Silas, her face filled with a strange kind of courage. "But prayers are quiet, and the city is loud. I heard that when people want something done fast, they don't go to church. They go to you." Silas felt a heavy knot in his chest. "I'm not a doctor, Mia. I don't save people." "I know what you are," Mia said, her voice shaking just a little. "The boys in the street say you're the devil. They say you can make anyone disappear. They say you have the power to stop anyone who gets in your way." She reached out and touched his hand, the same hand that had signed orders to hurt people and take their homes. Her fingers were ice cold. "Cancer is a monster, Mr. Silas. It's hurting my brother. It's taking him away, and nobody is stopping it." She looked at the crumpled dollar bill Silas still held. "I'm hiring you to be the devil one more time. I want you to find the people who have the medicine and make them give it to us. I want you to fight the monster that the doctors can't beat. I want to buy a miracle, and they say you're the only man who can deliver one." Silas looked at the dollar. In his world, he used his power to destroy things. He used his name to spread fear. But this little girl was asking him to use his darkness for the light. She was asking the most dangerous man in the city to do a job that belonged to a higher power. For a long time, Silas didn't breathe. The silence of the street was back, but this time, it was inside his own head. He realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't want to be the man everyone feared. He wanted to be the man this little girl thought he was. "A deal is a deal," Silas said, his voice low and firm. "Show me your brother." Silas followed Mia up the narrow, creaking stairs of the apartment building. The air smelled of cabbage and damp wood, but Silas barely noticed. His mind was miles away, trapped in a memory he had spent 20 years trying to bury. Every time his shoe hit a loose floorboard, the sound echoed like a heartbeat in his ears, pulling him back to a time before he was the saint. He remembered a room much like this one. He remembered the sound of a hollow cough and the way the winter wind whistled through cracks in the glass. Back then, he didn't wear pinstripe suits or gold watches. He was just a boy with holes in his shoes and a sister named Elena who was fading away. Elena had been like Mia, full of light and brave words. She had told him not to worry, even when her face grew thin and her eyes grew too large for her head. Silas had tried everything to save her. He had worked 3 jobs, he had begged on street corners, and he had eventually stolen his first handful of cash just to buy her a bottle of syrup that did nothing. He had stood in front of expensive hospitals, staring at the clean white walls, knowing that the miracles inside were only for people with money. Elena had died on a Tuesday, clutching a doll that was missing an arm. On that day, Silas had made a silent promise to the cold walls of their room. He promised that he would never be weak again. He promised that he would own the city, so that no one could ever tell him no. He had built his empire out of anger and iron, thinking that if he became a monster, the world could never hurt him again. But as he watched the back of Mia's small head, Silas realized he had lied to himself. He had become the very person he used to hate. He was the man in the big building who didn't care. He was the person who made life harder for people like Elena. "We're here," Mia whispered, stopping in front of a door with peeling green paint. Silas felt a sharp pain in his chest, a crack in the armor he had worn for decades. The dollar bill in his hand felt hot, like it was burning through his skin. He wasn't just here to help a stranger's brother. He was standing at the door of his own past, given a second chance to fight the monster he had lost to all those years ago. He realized that all his millions of dollars couldn't bring Elena back, but they could surely start a war for the boy on the other side of this door. The door creaked open, and Silas stepped into a room that felt smaller than the walk-in closet in his mansion. The air was thin and cold. There was no heater, only a single candle burning on a wooden table. Shadows danced against the walls, which were covered in peeling wallpaper and damp spots. As Silas looked around, he realized that this wasn't just a home, it was a cage made of poverty. In the corner, on a mattress that sat directly on the floor, lay a small boy. He looked like a tiny bird, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. Next to him was a woman whose face was lined with a tired kind of sadness. She looked up at Silas, her eyes widening in terror. She knew exactly who he was. Everyone in this neighborhood knew the man who collected the tax. She moved as if to shield her son, her hands trembling. "It's okay, Mama," Mia whispered, rushing to the bedside. "The saint is here. I hired him." Silas stood in the center of the room, his expensive wool coat looking out of place against the bare floor. He felt a deep sense of shame. He had sat in boardrooms and fancy restaurants, looking at maps of the city and calling it his territory. But he had never looked at the people living inside the lines he drew. He saw a bucket in the corner catching drips from a leaky ceiling. He saw a plate on the table with nothing but a few crusts of bread. This was the order he had created. He had been so busy making sure he was powerful that he hadn't noticed he was sucking the life out of the very streets he walked on. Every dollar he had ever taken from a shopkeeper or a baker was a dollar that could have fixed this roof or bought a warm blanket for the boy on the floor. He realized that he wasn't a king at all, he was just a thief who wore a better suit. The boy on the mattress coughed, a dry, rattling sound that made Silas flinch. It was the same sound his sister had made. Silas looked down at the crumpled dollar bill in his hand. He had spent his whole life trying to forget the dark, but now he was standing right in the middle of it. He realized that the miracle Mia wanted wasn't just medicine. It was for someone to finally care. Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers, usually so steady, were shaking as he dialed a private number. He didn't look at the mother's fear or the boy's pale face. He looked at the shadows in the corner and decided that tonight, the dark was going to lose. Silas didn't wait for the woman to speak. He pressed the phone to his ear, his eyes fixed on the boy's shallow breathing. When a voice answered on the second ring, Silas didn't use his usual cold, business tone. He spoke with a command that sounded like a crack of thunder. "Dr. Eris, get your emergency team and the mobile ICU unit to 4th and Miller." "Now," Silas ordered. There was a break on the other end. "Boss? That's the slums. My equipment is worth millions. If we take it there without a police escort—" "I am the escort," Silas snapped, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "Bring the best specialists. Bring the medicine for advanced lung trauma. If you aren't here in 15 minutes, don't bother coming back to work tomorrow. Or ever." He hung up and looked at Mia's mother. She was still hugged by her son, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and pure terror. She had seen Silas Vane destroy lives with a flick of his wrist, seeing him try to save one was almost more frightening. Silas reached out and placed the crumpled $1 bill on the small wooden table. He smoothed it out with his thumb, treating it with more respect than a stack of $100 bills. Outside, the neighborhood began to hum with a different kind of energy. Usually, the arrival of black SUVs meant trouble, but tonight was different. Within 20 minutes, the narrow street was filled with the bright, flashing lights of private medical vehicles. Men in clean, white coats rushed into the crumbling building, carrying heavy metal cases and glowing monitors. They looked like astronauts landing on a different planet. The word spread like wildfire through the underworld. In dark backrooms and fancy clubs across the city, Silas's lieutenants stared at their phones in disbelief. The saint was wasting elite resources on a nobody. To the Mafia, this was more than just a strange act, it was a scandal. It was a sign that their leader had a heart, and in their world, a heart was a target. Down in the small room, the doctors worked quickly, their machines beeping and whirring. The light from the heart monitor cast a soft blue glow on the walls. For the first time, the boy's breathing slowed down, becoming deep and even. Silas stood by the door, his arms crossed, watching the miracle he had bought for $1. He knew that by doing this, he had declared war on his own people. He could hear the sirens of his own men approaching in the distance, and he knew they weren't coming to help. The blue light from the medical monitors reflected off the windows of the apartment, but outside, a different kind of light was approaching. Silas stood by the cracked window and watched as 3 black sedans turned the corner, their headlights cutting through the rain like blades. He didn't need to see the faces inside to know who they were. He knew the sound of those engines. They were his own men, led by Russo. Down on the street, Russo climbed out of the lead car. He didn't look like a loyal soldier anymore, he looked like a man who smelled blood in the water. He looked up at the glowing window of the poor apartment and spat on the ground. To Russo, Silas wasn't a king anymore. He was a broken machine. In the world of the Mafia, mercy was a virus, and Russo believed it was the cure. "He's actually doing it," Russo muttered to the men surrounding him. They all carried heavy weapons, their faces hidden by the shadows of their hoods. "The saint is playing doctor in a slum. He's throwing away our reputation for a kid and a crumpled dollar. If the other families hear about this, they'll laugh us out of the city. We'll lose everything." The men murmured in agreement. They didn't care about the boy's life or Mia's courage. They only cared about the power they stood to lose if their leader went soft. They had spent years being feared, and they weren't ready to give that up. "The code is simple," Russo said, his voice cold and flat. "A boss who can't lead with iron isn't a boss. He's a liability. We go in, we finish the job, and we show the street that nobody, not even the saint, gets to change the rules." Silas watched from above as his men began to spread out, surrounding the building. He could hear the heavy thud of their boots entering the lobby 3 floors below. He turned away from the window and looked at Mia. She was sitting by her brother's bed, holding the headless teddy bear, her eyes wide as she heard the shouting start downstairs. The doctors looked up, panicked. "Mr. Vane, what's happening? We need more time to stabilize the boy." Silas reached into his jacket and pulled out his weapon, but he didn't look like a man ready to kill for profit. He looked like a man protecting his only home. He walked over to the door and turned the heavy lock. "Keep working," Silas said, his voice calm but terrifyingly sharp. "I've spent 20 years building a world of monsters. It's time I reminded them why I'm the one who wears the crown." The first kick hit the door downstairs, and the mutiny at midnight began. Silas stood in the hallway alone, a king without an army, ready to fight the very shadow he had created. The sound of the front door splintering downstairs echoed up the stairwell like a gunshot. Silas stood in the narrow, dimly lit hallway, his back to the room where the doctors were working. He checked his weapon with practiced ease, but his heart wasn't cold like it usually was. It was thumping with a fierce, protective heat. He wasn't fighting for territory or a suitcase full of cash tonight. He was fighting for a miracle. "Stay inside. Lock the door," Silas shouted over his shoulder. He heard the heavy click of the deadbolt behind him. Now it was just him and the shadows. The first 2 men rounded the corner of the second-floor landing. They were young, eager to prove themselves to Russo. When they saw Silas standing there alone, they didn't see a legend, they saw an old man who had lost his way. They raised their weapons, but Silas was faster. He didn't move like a boss, he moved like the ghost he had become. With 2 quick movements, he disarmed the first man and felt the second tumbling back down the stairs. He wasn't trying to be cruel, he was being a wall that would not break. "Silas! Give it up!" Russo's voice boomed from the darkness below. "You're throwing your life away for $1. Step aside, and maybe we'll let you walk away." "The price was $1, Russo." Silas cried back, his voice vibrating against the thin walls. "And the contract is already signed." A hail of bullets suddenly shredded the plaster above Silas's head. Dust and white powder filled the air, making it hard to breathe. Silas dove behind a heavy cast-iron radiator as more of his former soldiers rushed the stairs. The hallway was too narrow for a big fight, which was exactly what Silas wanted. He used the tight space to his advantage, using his strength to block the path and his knowledge of the building to surprise them. He felt a sharp sting in his shoulder as a bullet grazed his suit. The expensive fabric he had once cared so much about was now torn and stained with blood. He didn't care. He thought of Mia's steady gaze and the boy's shallow breathing. Every time a man tried to push past him toward that green door, Silas pushed back twice as hard. He was a whirlwind of motion, a man who had spent 20 years learning how to destroy, now using every bit of that dark knowledge to defend. One by one, the men fell back, terrified by the look in Silas's eyes. He didn't look like a mobster anymore. He looked like a guardian. By the time Russo reached the top of the stairs, he found Silas standing over a dozen fallen men, his shirt torn, his face smeared with soot, but his gaze as steady as an iron mountain. The saint hadn't fallen. He had just finally found something worth fighting for. The hallway was quiet again, the only sound being the heavy, ragged breathing of Silas and the distant hum of the medical machines behind the green door. Russo lay defeated at the bottom of the stairs, and the men who followed him had fled into the night, terrified by a man who was willing to die for a child's hope. Silas leaned against the wall, his hand pressed against his wounded shoulder. He looked down at his torn pinstripe suit and realized it didn't matter. The armor was gone, but for the first time, he felt truly strong. A soft click came from the door behind him. One of the doctors stepped out, pulling off his surgical mask. He looked tired, but he was smiling. "He's stable, Mr. Vane. The medicine worked. He's sleeping peacefully now." Silas didn't say a word. He pushed off the wall and walked into the room. The blue light of the monitors was softer now, matching the early light of the morning sun peeking through the window. Mia was still there, curled up in a wooden chair with her teddy bear, her eyes closed. Her brother, Leo, had color in his cheeks for the first time. His breathing was deep and quiet. The monster had been defeated. Silas walked to the small wooden table and picked up the crumpled dollar bill he had smoothed out earlier. He looked at it for a long time. This single dollar had caused a war, ended his old life, and saved a family. He realized that his old way of thinking, his logic over emotion code, was a lie. He had spent his life counting money and power, but those were things you could lose in a second. What he saw in this room, the love of a sister and the breath of a child, was the only thing that actually lasted. As the sun rose over the city, Silas didn't return to his mansion. He stayed in the neighborhood. He used his wealth to fix the roofs, to stock the bakery shelves, and to turn his protection teams into people who actually protected the weak. He kept his nickname, the Saint, but the people didn't whisper it in fear anymore. They said it with a nod of respect. On the wall of his new, simple office in the heart of the slums, there was only one thing framed behind glass. It wasn't a degree or a trophy. It was a single, wrinkled $1 bill. It reminded him every day that the greatest debts aren't paid in gold or blood. They are paid in mercy, in courage, and in the promises we keep to those who have nothing left but a prayer. Silas Vane had finally learned the truth. He didn't own the city's destiny, he was just lucky enough to serve it.